welcome this morning to our last of 3 webinars on trauma. Today we're going to talk about dissociative identity disorder. In particular, we're going to talk a little bit more about trauma and then what dissociative identity disorder is, how it develops, and we'll talk a little bit about the healing process and then what it means for your work. All right, so before we get started, let me just make sure I covered all the points that we're going to make first. So we're going to explore trauma and DID, and we're going to connect it to violence and examine that impact of trauma. And then we're going to look at some strategies to assist survivors with DID to access services and responses that you're involved in. So either sexual assault services or other kinds of victim services, as well as if they are trying to access responses, either our legal system or the criminal justice system or something like that, then they'll need some help with that. And in doing that, we're going to look at issues of accommodation that you might be able to raise as a way of helping people with DID access services and responses. So before I go further, what I wanted to do was just see how many of you, what's your knowledge of dissociative identity disorder. So Peter, let's go through the poll questions and see kind of where people are at. Okay, so how many of you have heard of dissociative identity disorder prior to hearing about this webinar? So if you can just go ahead and fill it out. And it looks like, Peter, am I reading this right? It looks like 100% of the people who are on our webinar have heard of DID before they heard about this webinar. Okay, so then let's go to the next question. So dissociative identity disorder used to be known as multiple personality disorder, true or false? And okay, so if you can go ahead and fill that out. So this is just kind of a way to gauge how much people, the preliminary kind of amount of information that you know about DID. And it's true that this used to be known as multiple personality disorder. They don't call it multiple personality disorder anymore, and there's a reason for it, and it's mostly because when you're talking about multiple personality disorder, you're talking about basically one end of the spectrum, and they realize that dissociative disorders and dissociative identity disorder can look different from survivor to survivor. There are some key things that people have that have DID, but the multiple personality disorder is kind of like a misnomer, basically, that it's not that you have different personalities in you, it's that you have different parts, but you're a whole person with different parts that for the most part don't tend to communicate with each other. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, Peter, so let's go to our next poll question. Have you worked with a survivor that had DID? Okay, so as people are filling that out, so it looks like a small number of you may have, but most of you have not. So about 29% of you have, and 71% have not. Okay, and I forget, Peter, do I have one last question? Yes, okay. So if you have worked with a survivor that had DID, how is it that you knew that they had DID? So either the survivor told you, you noticed the signs of DID, or did another professional tell you? Okay, so this is really helpful. So about 67% of those folks that have worked with someone with DID had the survivor tell them, and about 33% noticed the signs. Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about DID from an unusual perspective, which is from the experience of having been diagnosed with DID. So I'll say that's unusual because it's really rare to have, first, to have someone that knows that they have DID. There are, I think they say that it's close, somewhere between 2 and 8 million Americans are diagnosed with DID. And then I believe, quite honestly, and you probably will agree with me, that I think the prevalence of DID is much higher once you realize how DID forms, like what are the conditions that make DID form. And then when you do this work, you know that there's a lot of people that have lived those kinds of conditions. So what I think is unusual about my presentation is that I have been diagnosed as someone that has DID, and I went through years of healing for the trauma that I experienced that caused the DID. And then I wrote a book about it, and I do presentations about it. So that's what's unusual. Not so much, I mean, the disorder itself, people think is more unusual than I think it really is. But it's that people will tell you that they have it and will have done a certain level of work on it and then do presentations on it. It's kind of rare. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through my experience of how I found out I had DID, the healing process, and then what this means for your work. If at any point in time you have questions, please feel free to put the questions in the chat, and I'll stop periodically, or Peter or Alma will stop me so that we can answer those questions. And I really, really encourage you to ask questions. Mostly this is my favorite presentation to do, mostly because I know it so well. And there is so little information out there on DID, and especially really good information about it. So so I really, really want to answer your questions about DID to the extent that I can, to the extent that you have them. Okay, so let's go through and I'll kind of walk you through my experience. So I was 31 years old, and at 31 years old, I was the General Counsel of the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice. So at 31, I was running a legal office in the part of the Department of Justice that basically gave out all the grants that the Justice Department gave. It's not where all the grants are now, but at the time that I was there, all the grants came out of that, including the Violence Against Women grants, Office for Victims of Crime, and then also Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Burn grants, and the Bureau of Justice Statistics Research and Evaluation grants. So I'm at 31, I'm really young to be in this position where I'm leading the legal office for this grant section of the Department of Justice. And I'm the only Latina to hold this position. And I'm in this position as a career employee. So I'm not a political appointee, but I've risen up through the ranks to be in this position. And at the time, I am married, and I have I've graduated. I've been out of law school now for about 5 years, and John, my husband at the time, was a really, really great guy. I met him in law school, and we were married. And then what happened is that all this is going on. My life is probably the best it's ever been. I'm in the safest place I've ever been. I have a really good relationship. I have accomplished a lot in my career and have a great deal of stability and safety in my life. Um, and we went to go see the movie Thelma and Louise. And in the beginning of that movie, there's an attempted rape scene that's very vivid for me. And I have what I think is a panic attack. And so I need to leave the theater, and John and I leave, and I am having a panic attack off and on all weekend long. And I don't remember that anything like that had happened to me, but I kept thinking, like, how can it happen that you can watch this rape scene and start panicking if something like that didn't happen to you? So it occurred to me during this weekend of really experiencing panic and pain that something like that must have happened to me, but I couldn't remember it. So what I did was we went home from the movie, and I looked up the number for the DC Rape Crisis Center. I called them. They helped me to understand, one, they helped me to calm down, and they helped me to understand that, yes, it's possible that I could have been raped and not remember. And it's possible that that scene in the movie had triggered that experience for me. So I called them off and on all weekend, and they helped to calm me down after each what I thought was a panic attack. And really, what it was is what is called an abreaction. So I'm reliving the incidents of violence that I had experienced when I was a kid that I didn't remember having experienced. And so that scene in the movie theater was a traumatic reminder. So those conditions, so that movie captured my interest so much, and I followed the movie in great like in the experience of the main characters. And when that one of the main characters was almost raped, that was a reminder, a trigger for me. That was a match for a time that I had been raped. And so then what I had was an abreaction, which is a coming together of the pain and the panic, and then this vague awareness that something like that had happened to me. So I was re-experiencing the pain and the emotions that I felt at the time that I had been raped. So, but at that time when I'm at home having this panic attack, quote unquote panic attack, I don't remember that. I'm just re-experiencing this and wondering what is going on. So I went to the DC Rape Crisis Center that Monday and met with an advocate there, and then was referred to a therapist in the area that worked with survivors of rape to try to figure out what is going on. And I worked with her for quite a while, and it just kind of wasn't, the therapy wasn't really working for me. I kept having panic attacks during my sessions, but not letting her know that I was having panic attacks. So I eventually asked her to refer me to someone else, and she referred me to the psychiatrist that was overseeing her work, that was supervising her work. And that's this guy right here. His name is Dr. Rich Sheffitz. And I just happened to go to him, and I was really lucky to be able to go to him. He is a past president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. He has written a number of journal articles and a book that came out in 2015 called Intensive Psychotherapy for Persistent Dissociative Processes. It's very much a therapist's book. And he was just incredibly skilled at this type of work, and I was really lucky to have been referred to him. I had no idea. I had no idea that I had DID, and I had no idea that I was working with one of the top clinicians in the country, if not in the world. So, um, so what happened? So in working with him, I was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. Now, let me say just one thing about what we kind of like what happened with the earlier therapist that wasn't working for me. So one, I think that the earlier therapist, because she was new to DID, I think I didn't feel safe in working with her without being able to say why. But the big thing was that she had correctly identified me as someone that had dissociative identity disorder, but she didn't tell me that that's what she was thinking that I had. And instead, what she was doing was she would see changes in me that meant that there were parts of me that were coming close to the surface at our sessions. And then she would talk to those parts directly. But I'm still there, and I can't figure out why she's talking to me like I'm a little kid, or why she's talking to me like I'm someone different. And so I kept having panic attacks. So a big part of the work around dissociative identity disorder is accepting the diagnosis and accepting and integrating the experiences of what happened to you. So because she wasn't introducing me to it, we were never doing that work, which would enable me to continue feeling safe and continue doing this work. Okay, so DID is basically the kind of baseline to determine whether someone has DID is a person with DID feels as if she has within her two or more entities, each with its own way of thinking and remembering about herself and her life. So I fell into that. And as you'll see in my story, I had quite a few parts of me that had different information and that felt separate from me, but were part of me. So these entities were previously called personalities, even though the term didn't accurately reflect the common definition of the word. And then other terms that are often used by therapists and survivors to describe these entities are alternate personalities, alters, parts, states of consciousness, ego states, and identities. I refer to mine as parts, and that's how I'll talk about them in our training. It's how I talk about them in my book. And it's really important to me that when I was working with someone that they used the term that I used. I know quite a few people. I've met people around the world that have DID, and we all have different terms for how we refer to who the parts inside. So I refer to them as parts. A lot of other people do as well. Some people refer to them as their people. Some people refer to them by name, and some people do use the word alters. Alters was a big term when I first started my healing process, but I didn't like it. It felt kind of alien to me, and it felt way more serious and different than parts did. So it's an important thing to pay attention if you are working with someone who has DID. It's really important to recognize that and how they refer to the other parts of them inside, and to use that same language. And it's important to keep in mind that although these alternate states may feel or appear to be different, they are all manifestations of a single whole person. And that's why we don't use the term personalities so much anymore. Okay, so let me just stop there. And so why do you need to know about dissociative identity disorder? I remember when my book came out and it was reviewed. I think it was Ms. Magazine reviewed it, and it was a psychiatrist that did a review. And at the very end, of the review, the psychiatrist said that this is a really rare disorder, that hardly anybody has it. And that was in 2011. And in 2011, when I would ask at presentations, how many of you have heard of DID? There'd be maybe one or two people that would raise their hand. And now when I'm doing a presentation, so last week I was in South Dakota and I was doing a presentation of 650 people. And I asked how many of them had heard of DID, and almost everyone had raised their hand. So I think people are starting to recognize that DID is more common. One, that it exists, and two, that it is more common than we think. And people are starting to see survivors, friends, parents, siblings, that and people that they're working with, survivors that they're working with, that have DID. So studies show that in the US, somewhere between 2 and 3% of the general public has DID, and that's based on the diagnoses of DID. I'm just going to tell you, it's way higher than that. And I have met people all across the country and across the world that have DID that don't necessarily have a formal diagnosis of DID, but it's really obvious that they have DID. There are many more who have it that we don't know about. And it comes about because of long-term abuse or neglect that started in childhood. And one of the big things is that it started in childhood before people were about the age of 8, 9, or 10. And that's because we have the ability to create imaginary friends. And we're in this situation where we can't escape, where there is severe neglect or abuse. And so we use that creativity of imaginary friends to split off and create parts of us that will hold on to the things that are happening to us that we can't escape, so that we don't know. So as a person, the person moving through the world, going to school and making friends, that keeps happening while this other stuff that's happening to us is staying away from our consciousness. And without help, it makes access to services and safety planning much more difficult. So it's really important that you know DID exists, how it affects people, in order to work well with them. And the key is really helping people stay safe and access services. All right. So I asked Peter to send everyone this link to the movie called I Am We. It's a movie clip. It's actually a documentary that is being produced about DID from the perspective of the people who have DID, and not focusing so much on the symptoms of DID, but focusing more on how it develops and how people live with it. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is to go ahead and because if I do it on this platform, it'll be too choppy and the sound and the video won't be connected. It takes about 3 minutes to watch the movie, so let's go ahead and take that time to watch the movie at your computer, at your desk, and then we'll come back and go from there. It's a really it's not at all triggering at all, but it's a nice little synopsis of what DID is. I love that video. It really, and I'm really looking forward to the development of and the release of that documentary. It's probably one of the only ones I've seen that has addressed the issue of dissociative identity disorder without exploiting the symptoms of it. It's really powerful. And you can see the number of people that have DID, and these are the people that know they have DID, not people that are walking around in the world that don't know that they have it, but are just kind of going through reacting and protecting themselves, moving through their days. So what happened is that in my work with and I refer to my psychiatrist as Rich. So instead of Dr. Sheffitz. But so in my work with Rich, I learned about DID, what it is. I had to learn about my structure inside, like how it was that I created parts, like who were they and what was their role. I learned what it was that caused me to develop DID. And then I realized in my preliminary work with Rich that I didn't have much memory of my past. I had I kind of knew that I didn't remember very much from my childhood. I did remember stuff from my childhood, but that was all stuff that happened at school or in playing sports or with friends. I didn't remember the things that happened in our home, which is where all the violence took place. And I didn't think there was anything weird about that. I just thought to myself that that was I had a really bad memory. And in fact, I don't have a really bad memory. I actually have a really great memory. It was that those things were so traumatic that I had developed this coping mechanism that took those incidents away from my consciousness and stored them someplace else. And because I could remember just the stuff that happened in school and with friends and playing sports and neighbors and stuff, I thought I had a happy childhood, but I didn't remember most of it. Um, and this is the not remembering very much of your childhood and the thinking that you had a happy childhood, but that you didn't remember most of it is a really common thread for identifying people with DID. So that amnesia thing, the losing time is a really um, big diagnostic. Okay, so what happened? What caused my dissociative identity disorder? So I won't get into the details of it, but I'll just give you kind of just a general overview. For those of you who had participated in the first webinar that I did, which was I think in the middle to late September. And that webinar I think is recorded if you want to go back and watch it, should you not have attended. So that webinar, I laid out kind of the abuse that I suffered as a child, and I'll show you in that webinar you'll see the ways in which violence then turned into trauma and how then what the signs are for dissociation and what that meant for how I would talk about the violence. But here I'm just going to kind of give you a snippet. So I'm 3 years old here, and at this point I'm engaged in my father's violence against my mom, and I'm also, this is the first memory that I have of being sexually abused by my father. So at 3 years old I'm raped by my father, and I'm being sexually abused by my father regularly. And this is a part of me that I developed to hold, that took that abuse and that hold on to those memories. And so that happened at 3. This abuse is continuing on. And when I'm 7 years old, the abuse takes a bit of a turn. My brothers are engaged in my sexual abuse. and if I get home from school and my father's the only one home, that's a match, a trigger for when I'm abused. And then I've, at this age, start initiating the sexual abuse. And at this age, this is my brothers, I'm 8 years old here, and my brothers are engaged in my sexual abuse. And then at this age, my father passes away, and now my brothers are engaging in rapes and gang rapes against me. And you see a stare develop. So these are all parts of me that I developed, as well as other parts, to hold on to that abuse someplace else so that I wouldn't know about it. And if I had known about it, I wouldn't have survived it. I for sure would have killed myself if I knew that that's what was happening in our home. So in the process of I wrote a book that came out in 2011 that I keep referring to. It's called The Sum of My Parts. And when I was writing that book, it was really, really important to me that people see DID and the dissociation that I so creatively used as a good thing. So in the book, I write about the things that are happening, and then I write about how it is that I dissociate and put that someplace else. And and I wanted people to be grateful that I had that ability to do that. And because that's how I felt through once I realized how much abuse I had suffered. That's what I wanted people to feel um, when they saw that, because it's how I felt once I realized that saved my life. So I survived all that violence, and it was basically sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, from the time that I'm 3 years old until I'm in my early 20s. And it's different people. For the most part, my brothers are engaged, then their friends are engaged. And then people can see the dissociation, um, because of what we know about neurobiology is basically that there's not just fight or flight, there's also freeze. And through all that abuse, I then develop a freeze response that looks like dissociation. I have a deeper stare. I don't fight back. I comply. I don't say no. I don't do anything. And so that's something that's identified by perpetrators that are that are in college campuses, or other areas where they're assessing whether someone they're testing whether someone is going to fight back. And so I'm I am victimized by people like that as well. So I survive all of this through dissociation. I also survive it because I have, like, at 3 years old, like, I survive pretty well considering all the abuse that happened, because I also developed parts of me um, that didn't hold abuse, but that would do things really well and that would know that there was good in the world. And that comes out of having these amazing connections with teachers and coaches, and the kindness of neighbors, and being kind of basically taken in by the parents of my friends in really positive ways. Um, and some of these people knew abuse was happening in our home, but in the 60s and 70s, they just really didn't know what to do with that. So what they did was to help me and connect with me as much as possible. And so I realized that that's kind of so I'm seeing Rich, and I'm in my early 30s, and I'm the general counsel of the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice, and I'm going through a healing process. And so I want to walk you through what that looks like, just so you have an idea. So basically, Rich and I opened the doors and went into each room. So the system that I developed, the structure that I had in my head for these parts, was a house. And in the back of the house, so this was a really big house with lots and lots of rooms. And in the back of the house were these rooms where the doors were painted black. And in the room were the parts of me that held um, aspects of memories of things that happened, and the abuse that happened to me. So so that all those rooms were painted black and were locked, and I couldn't go in those rooms. And then I created rooms in the front of the house that the doors were left open and that were really brightly colored and had big windows in them. There was a lot of light. And these were parts of me that I created to be able to function and succeed and do well. And that was in part because when I was 3 years old, I spent a lot of time with my next door neighbor. And in spending time with her, I realized how good I could feel, when I was with people that were really kind and nice. Um, and also people who, if I did well in the things that I was like in school, um, if I in sports. If I did well, then I would feel good about myself from the feedback of those people. And so I learn about dissociative identity disorder, and I start going in those rooms, and I start um, finding out who's in there. And so, and that work is really, really difficult. The ways in which the modalities that Rich used in order for me to go through this process safely is, and let me just say, because I'm using the word safely quite a bit, and I really do mean, like, you, in order to heal from this level of trauma, you have to have emotional safety, you have to have physical safety, and it's a and to have someone witness uh, what happened to you, so that it is not such a, like, so it's not just the experience that you had. And in the process of doing that, we also have, like, there's modalities that Rich used that would help me then think about and act differently. So I'm processing that trauma, but I'm also changing the way I think about what's happened and about who I am as a person. So the first thing that Rich uses is a combination of psychosocial therapy. So so CBT is cognitive behavior therapy. Um, and in cognitive behavior therapy, that's basically rewiring the brain, taking some of the toxic messages that I heard as I was abused, and I heard in the ways in which I was mistreated, that I took on. So changing those. And then dialectical behavior therapy. So recognizing that I had um, these really compelling thoughts, and some people call them voices. For me, it all felt like thoughts, and not, like, being able to pay attention to them, but not act on them. And so, kind of learning to kind of have sit with some of the really, really painful things, and know I'm going to be okay, and not having to act on each one. And then we did part work. So that's the work of going in those rooms and meeting those parts and learning more about what those parts um, did and say. Okay, so let me just stop right there real quick. So we have a question about whether EMDR was used at all, and it wasn't used in my therapy. Well, toward the end of the first part of my therapy, Rich tried to use it, and it didn't really work for me. And I'm not sure. So EMDR is really, you have to be really, really skilled in EMDR and in working with people with DID to be able to pull it off. Um, and in large part because if I have parts, then which part of me are you working? In order to do the eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing. So, um, and so for me, the talking through, like, the so the way that this kind of played out is I would see fragments first of what happened, and I would talk about what I'm seeing, but I would have a certain amount of distance from it, and that's because of the hypnosis. And then after I would see the fragments and talk about them, then the emotions would come that I experienced. So that's when I would experience the panic and the the fear, um, and then some of the overwhelming grief, and and then I would start feeling the rage. And with that, then over as I'm feeling more and more of the emotions, I'm also having the body memories. So some of the pain of what happened. And the rage always came last because it was always the hardest to feel. because it felt like I was like them if I felt that level of rage. And then the way hypnosis was continued to be used is that so when I started opening those rooms and meeting the parts of me, there was space for parts. And so then there was this sense of urgency to try to have, um, you know, to tell the story and to tell it um, and have someone, hear it. And so then there was like almost like a flooding, like all these parts wanted to come forward and tell about their experience. And so I had to be able to leave my therapy sessions and go back to work and function in the world until my next therapy session. So hypnosis was used to contain a lot of that. And then also late in my healing process, I was mostly worried about the freeze response and that I didn't want, as I learned about how much risk I had been under because of the dissociative response, I wanted to be able to connect the rage to someone crossing my boundary, someone potentially identifying me as a victim. So Rich helped me with hypnosis to connect someone crossing my boundary with rage. And then I had to learn to kind of modify, like adjust the level of rage that I had based on, what was really going on. So I also used art therapy. We did I did a lot of body work, massage therapy, healing touch, acupuncture, all things to help release some of the pain. And I also took yoga classes and then had mindfulness practice. So these types of things, the art therapy, the body work, and the mindfulness um, is all releasing. So there's this connection between trauma in the brain and trauma in your body. The ways in which we hold on to pain and the ways in which our bodies are affected. The adrenal glands, the adrenal system is connected. The nervous system is connected. So there's therapeutic things that you put in place that is not talk therapy that helps to release that and helps to process the trauma. And that's the things like art therapy, like massage and healing touch, acupuncture, yoga, the things that kind of you move your body to release. And then at the very end, the emotions work. So feeling the emotions that I felt and could not integrate, could not feel at the time that these things were happening. So that's a lot of information. And before I'm going to go through these slides just to make sure that I didn't forget anything. Let me just stop there and see if there's any other questions. So I saw the question about EMDR, and again, that wasn't successful for me. I think that there are clinicians that are using that in working with people with DID, but I think that they've been working with people with DID and EMDR really well, because that's really kind of fine tuning how you're figuring out who you're reprocessing this with. So are there other questions that folks have about the healing process that I've discussed so far? And I'm looking at the chat and the question box, and I'm not seeing anything so far. But thanks so much, Heidi, for your questions. I really do appreciate them. It helps to know that you guys are there. Otherwise, it kind of feels a little bit like I'm talking into a black hole. Okay, so if you do have questions, feel free to keep going back to the chat, and I'll move us along so that I can get to what helps. So I just wanted to mention again, in cognitive behavior therapy, we reframed how I thought about myself and my abuse, And the reason that it works so well is because of neuroplasticity, meaning we can rewire the brain by doing something or thinking about something the same way over and over and over again. We can rewire the brain. The way this played out for me is that in the beginnings, when I would remember things that happened, I would say the things about myself that I heard and that I was told. And then Rich would help me understand that better. So one of the things that I was told was that it was my fault. And then Rich would kind of, the first time we talk about it, first time I mentioned it, he'd pull it apart and we'd look at that. And in looking at that, I realized that I didn't want this to happen to me. This was a triggered response, basically when I started to initiate or when I complied. And so then the next time I would say it, he would remind me about that therapy session. And then the next time I'd say it, he'd say the reframed thing that we knew, that this wasn't something that I wanted or made people do to me. This was something that was done to me. And then over time, I would stop saying it, but I would start to think it, and then the reframing of it was what I would think immediately afterwards. And then over time, I would stop thinking it and just think of the reframed version, and which is how I present now. I tell you how it is that that a trigger, like basically how it is that I had the response to fight, and then over time I stop fighting back, and then I dissociate, and how those worked. So it's a really, really powerful thing, cognitive behavior therapy. It takes a lot of time, but it's totally worth it. And it really helped me with anxiety, depression. I had major depressive disorder while I was going through the healing process, which is really common with people with DID. When you're going through the process of healing, it helped me to manage my world and then to live in the world. Cognitive behavior therapy was really powerful way for me to, now, if I didn't do this work, I'd forget that I had DID. And then dialectical behavior therapy, as I said, I didn't have to act on all my thoughts. I would notice them and then go behind them. And the part work, which some people refer to as integrated family systems, it's not integrated family systems, it's similar to that, but it's different in the sense that I'm meeting the parts that I created as opposed to assuming that I have certain parts of me that are there that had certain roles. So in that way, it's very different. And it's also, I found, I do a lot of peer support with people with DID, and I found that people are trying to figure out, well, people are being treated for DID with IFS alone, and that doesn't really work for people with DID. This process of cognitive behavior therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, the use of hypnosis for containment and distance, like this package of therapy is designed for people with DID, and IFS is designed for a particular type of person that has, there's a theory behind it that people have parts and that people have all these certain parts, as opposed to the level of trauma behind some of these other parts. I don't know if that makes any sense. I do have a couple questions. How do you feel before and after different parts switch? So when I had a whole bunch of different parts, I learned to really pay attention to how I felt and what I was thinking. And so there'd be differences in how it felt to switch. So for example, if it was an easy switch, I wouldn't really notice the switch. What I would notice is that I felt a little bit odd and that my thoughts felt different than how I was feeling before, and almost like I was helpless to change what I was saying or change what I was doing. Um, So that was if the switch was easy. If there was a struggle inside for, like, so let's say a part of me wanted to come forward and talk about this really bad, incident that happened, but other parts inside didn't want that to happen. Then I would feel I would have it would feel like I was having like 1,000 thoughts all at the same time, and I would have a hard time verbalizing any of them. Sometimes I would feel like I had a headache, or I would feel dizzy, a little disoriented, and then there, until that struggle was resolved, and then I would have a part of me that came forward, and I would feel as though I was watching, a little bit helpless to stop or change what I was saying or doing. And those were, and it would be something from an easy switch to that's a really hard switch, and I had to learn then to know that that's what that was, that was conflict inside and a struggle. So I hope that's helpful in terms of that question. The other question that I have, are your parts separate, or do they have the ability to talk and work together? Okay, so that's a big part of this work. So initially, I had this big house with all these rooms, and they were really solid rooms, big walls, doors, furniture in the room, um, trap doors in the room. Like, it was really sophisticated. And so after years of doing this work, and I want to say most of that, the bulk of that was initially like 5 years that I worked with Rich on just consistently. And after 5 years of doing that, I had basically um, communication and collaboration inside, which is what you're trying to do. The goal of this work is not to get rid of parts, but to meet parts and promote or get collaboration inside, so you can work together as one. Not necessarily that you have to be one, but that there is almost like, some people call them huddles, like in a football game, like let's huddle, and people have meetings every morning or huddles every morning. So, and that's part of and as you learn that, you you go through that process of healing, you get more and more collaboration. The more and more parts that you meet, the more collaboration there is. Now, for me, in healing, there were a lot of parts of me that their only role was to hold on to this information and to take this level of abuse. But I didn't have that abuse going on in my life now. And so those parts of me, once I realized what happened, I learned what they did and how they did it, and learned basically how to work together. So I learned who they were and how I worked together. I learned to pay attention to my thoughts and to pay attention to my body. And that's how I would know whether I could do something or not, or whether there was conflict inside, or whether I was triggered by something. And so one of the questions inside, is my DID cured? I move through the world with what I call cohesive multiplicity, meaning that I still have a couple kind of parts. And the way I look at it is, basically, I went from this house with all these rooms to basically a loft. And the loft has like maybe this little half wall over here and this other half wall over there. And so I reintegrated all those experiences, but I still have like a couple kind of parts. And one part was a part of me that was developed when I would stay with my next door neighbor's house. And that part of me isn't like a big P kind of part, but I can still feel that part of me, that role inside of me, and that's to know that there's good in the world. And I'm really good with having that part. So I'm like, I really like knowing that there's good in the world. And that's that part of me, that's that 3-year-old picture of me, that I look happy, and that I recognize that there are good people in the world. And and I know a lot of them. And then there's a part of me that's not a big people part, like not a full wall, but but steps in when someone is when I'm having a hard time with someone, because they're not listening or it doesn't feel like they're um, honoring my boundaries, and that's a protective part of me, and that's that anger that comes up and distance, and people who know me well call that my lawyer part. Um, so so I use the skills that I learned in law school and as a lawyer to basically stop people when they're doing things that feel unsafe to me. So, and um, that level of cohesiveness and being able to move through the world as though I don't have DID happened because of the compassion that I developed and the appreciation that I had for them. Without recognizing how important they were to my survival, I was not going to be able to work well together with my parts. And then once I get to know them and understand why they're there, then I'm better able to take care of them, keep myself safe, stay in touch with them to make sure that I can move through the world pretty cohesively. So I have another question about do your parts age? So that's a really good question. So that part of me that reminds me that there's good in the world, that part of me is 3 years old. And it's not a big part, like it doesn't kind of take over. I can feel that the presence of that part of me when I'm having a hard time. And I feel like it's a little bit kind of like the cognitive behavior therapy. Like as I'm struggling with something, either because of depression or because something's really hard, because I have to work with somebody who isn't like the people that I normally work with, that are safe, that practice kind of good habits, interpersonal habits, that don't do triangulation, that don't, people that like talk directly and are do what they say, and that kind of thing. When I work with people who aren't like that, then I feel, um, you know, that lawyer part of me comes in. So it's funny that 3-year-old part of me has never aged, but that um that part of me that kind of kicks in when somebody crosses a boundary, that feels like that part has aged, and I'm not sure if that's accurate. Mostly because through hypnosis, after I was a lawyer and seeing Rich, we created kind of like we connected the anger or the rage that I had to someone crossing, and it's almost like I developed a role for this part that was an older role and skills than it was when it was initially developed. Um, I'll just say that the aging process is harder when you have parts because sometimes you feel like you're a lot younger, stronger, more capable than you actually are. And then has my DID ever relapsed? So I'm not sure if I would say that it relapsed as much as I would say that there are times um, that when things are really hard, that I'll have, um, I don't know even how to describe it, that I'll struggle. And and when I'm struggling, I might find myself dissociating, which is something I try to pay really close attention to. Um, and I'll find myself distancing quite a bit, kind of not being in my body. Um, and so that's not so much a DID shifting, switching, having parts come up thing, but something's really hard and I'm not recognizing how hard it is. And so then I go to dissociating to get through it. There are times when things are really hard that I will be kind of edgier and more negative, and that's an indication that that protective part of me is taking up more space. So I think that's the closest I've ever come to relapsing. There will be times that I will try to do things that don't feel safe for me to do inside. And then I'll experience physical pain. And that'll be kind of like that part of me um, preventing me from doing it. Like I'm not paying attention to my thoughts, and so I'm ignoring them, like, so I know that this feels unsafe, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so those are the ways in which that I'm reminded that I do have DID. um so I hope that makes sense, the way I've just described it, because it makes perfect sense to me in my head. But and then I have another question, that is, are there any parts that are stronger than others or in conflict with each other? Yeah, so that protective part of me, that lawyer part of me, is probably the strongest part I have. And there is conflict with that part, because it'll be something that I'm ignoring when that part comes forward, and it's like, you can't trust this person, or you can't do that, or but I'm not seeing the threat as clearly as that part of me. I don't know if that makes sense. So then that comes in, and then there is conflict. Okay, so another question: what would you say suggest to family, friends, to best support someone living with DID? Yeah, so learn as much as you can about DID. Talk to them about their experience of it. Help them help and support the therapy. Help them to assess whether the therapy that they're getting is right for them. And there isn't, I have to say, there is not very much out there for partners and loved ones of people with DID. In fact, so much so that I'm in the process of writing a book for people who love people with DID, just so they can understand a little bit better what's going on, because there are a few things out there, but they're kind of not so good. So anyway, so that's one thing. And don't try to talk. So the biggest thing for me that I try to get my friends to do, and sometimes have to remind them, is don't try to talk me into something that I don't feel I can do. I'm already going to feel bad that I can't do it. So don't try to talk me into it. It's really hard to be spontaneous when you have DID, if you have communication inside, because you got to check in. So people who know that about me are patient, let me think things through before answering. Don't try to shame me, or don't try to get me to do things that don't feel right, or don't feel um, like it's that I should do it. The other thing is, I think it's really important for people to recognize how amazing it is that they have DID. I mean, that means that they were, one, that they're really smart, two, that they were crazy creative in an impossible situation, and that it's normal if you think about what they survived. A lot of times, because we are more, you have to be pretty smart to be able to pull off DID. A lot of times we find out we're really high functioning, smart people, and we find out at this place in our lives where we don't want anybody to know, because we've achieved like a certain level of success. But all along, we don't feel confident in our skills. For me, confidence really, like, I could feel from the inside how smart um, and creative and clever I was through the healing process, because I always felt like I wasn't as smart as the people around me, and that I was faking it. Um, but I realized that I accomplished all the things that I accomplished, and I survived all this violence. So that's when I really felt like I was pretty smart. That's when I felt confident. Um, so I want to go through, because I realize I love these questions, by the way. Thank you so much for asking. I really appreciate it. But I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead. So these are these are the ways in which these other therapies helped. And and you will get a copy of this PowerPoint. But I'm going to skip ahead of these just so you can see though what's in here, because I want to kind of get to this place where, and I'm gonna go a little further. In fact, let me have these slides. I was cracking up when I do this. Let me go toward the end because I want to give you some tips in terms of your work. And again, you'll have access to this PowerPoint. So we went through that. Okay, so a couple things when you're working with someone as an advocate or as a friend and you're just helping them to kind of figure something else, how to stay safe. A couple things is repeating things as often as needed to try to like slow down and have patience. Try to keep things as simple as possible. So when you experience this level of trauma, sometimes nuance is very, very hard. And so keeping things really basic, straight, like not so much like a lower level of intelligence kind of basic, but simple. Like it's hard when you've got this level of unresolved trauma to be able to read people's faces and so we often misread people and we often have a view that has something to do with something we did wrong or something we did badly. So reassuring people regularly that that's not going on, trying not to be nuanced, be direct, be kind, and keep things simple. Talk about what dissociation feels like and some of the issues around keeping yourself safe with dissociation. Teaching people how to ground themselves is really helpful. So getting them to feel what it feels like when they dissociate so they know that they're doing it, and then teaching them to ground themselves is really important. Helping people understand how we all need to work together. So if you know the person has DID and they've told you, then when you're trying to strategize around issues of safety, to say things like, well, let's all see if we can all work together on this. Don't talk directly to parts unless they've talked to you. But you can ask the person that you're working with, so how can we get everybody to work together? And then put up a plan and be willing to do this over and over again. The more that you work with someone in this way, the more that they're going to think about things in this way. And that again is because of neuroplasticity. The more that you do things a certain way, it rewires your brain to do it that way. This is for domestic violence programs. A lot of times the way that our programs are set up aren't conducive for people with DID. It's really hard to share a room. It's really hard not to be able to lock your door. It's really hard to sleep at night at times. If you don't recognize that people with DID tend to observe a lot and not engage, then you're going to see someone and you're going to think that they might not be actively engaged in your program, when what it is really is that they're withdrawn. So then you need to engage them in a positive way to help them access the programs, the services that you have. Know that people with DID have a lot going on in their head. A lot of people describe the things that they're hearing in their head as voices. I always thought of them, they always felt like thoughts, and that's because all my parts were parts of me at different ages. And so for me, it was like I had racing thoughts, like I would have a million thoughts at once and I couldn't pay attention to all of them, and I would try to grasp them to be able to say them. And so it feels a little bit like that, or white noise. It's hard to concentrate, it's hard to read. So the more that you can do things for people in different modes of learning, the more successful you'll be with folks. And then, like I said, the grounding techniques are really important. One of the handouts that you have is on preparing survivors for court. And in that, I walk you through kind of how to ground someone. And it'll be in the context of court. But one other thing that you can do is you can ask people to identify like 5 things that are blue in the room, or 3 things that are wood, or, you know, like, so that brings people back into the room when they do that. And I think that's called the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding technique. And it doesn't matter really what 5 things you ask for. It's mostly like things that are in the room that are here and now. Predictability. So I'm going to end on this slide. Predictability is the key to success. The more that you plan ahead, the more that you prepare, the more successful you're going to be helping a survivor with DID. Anxiety is a big part of what happens, and it creates dissociation because we're numbing out most of the time. So if things feel unsafe, we'll dissociate or we'll switch. But so keeping things feeling safe is important, and how you do that is by letting people know what to expect. And again, the Preparing Survivors for Court handout, in there I talk about, like, I give you an example of how you would help someone go and participate in a court hearing. Well, you can take that and you can apply that to anything that you're doing with someone who's a survivor with DID. The other thing, so planning ahead and keeping things predictable and breaking things down. The other thing is limiting simulation. It's overwhelming. So simulation might be too much color, too much noise, too many things to look at once. So like Best Buy, for example, with a lot of TVs on and a lot of colorful things. Grocery stores can be hard. Libraries. So, and these are all things, these are places that you might be working with someone. So try to find quieter rooms without a lot going on in them, but not too small a room because that can feel claustrophobic as well. And then again, modes of communication. So diagramming things, walking people through things, and giving people things in writing. If you do all of those, it'll be easier for people to retain it. And then what I would recommend is that you talk to people about trauma and related issues and how they might handle them. So like this, so if you do any kind of support groups, I would bring in issues of trauma as a learning thing so that people might find themselves in that trauma. And then they might have a better sense of what might be going on for them. And then you can have discussions around how best to handle them. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and see if there's any last questions. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the questions that you've asked, because it helps to feel that this information is worthwhile, and that other folks are realizing that they're dealing with people with DID. And I'll just say, I'll just close on this one thing. Sorry to be so self-promoting, but the book that I wrote is called The Sum of My Parts. It's a survivor story of dissociative identity disorder. The first half of the book talks about what happened to me, and it contrasts the things that happened to me with the ways in which people helped me, and how simple it was, that the things that people did that really, really helped. The second half of the book is on the process of healing. This book, if you're a clinician, the second half of the book can be really helpful for people who are just starting to realize that they have DID. In one way, it can be helpful. It'll be, what I've had clinicians and people with DID write me and tell me at times at conferences that reading the book, the second half of the book, was the first time that they felt like somebody understood their experience. And they can they've gone through that last half as a way of articulating what's happening in their heads. So the types, so I do have this one last question. The types of symptoms that a counselor might see or an inpatient unit might see are the switching. So one, the deep stare and dissociating, like that person's gone. And then also the switching, the drastic changes in someone, or they're dressing differently. They sound like they're younger than they are. They might ask you to call them by different names. You'll talk to them, and then later they won't remember that you guys had a conversation. They won't remember any aspect of the conversation. So all that is gives you a sense that someone is losing time, so that they're switching inside from one part to the other, and that the information isn't being shared. I think that's the hardest piece to work with, because people aren't remembering and not sharing the information. It's harder in terms of healing. And if you are a clinician, then you want to refer them to someone who really works with DID. If you're an advocate and they're getting help, because you don't want to make people go to therapy, you can identify some of these things as things that you've noticed. But if I'm working with someone and that's happening, then I'm going to look at how it is that I can accomplish what I need to accomplish, despite the fact that that's happening. And that might be giving people things in writing that they can, or in drawings that they can take with them and look at later, and share with everyone. So, all right, I'll stop there. Yeah, thank you so much for listening. And my email is, if you have any questions, I'm going to put it right here in the chat. I would I will get back to you. I might not get back to you right away. And if you don't see a response from me within a week, you should check your spam filter. But if you have any other questions, it is my passion to get people to know what DID is. It exists, and that it doesn't mean that we're crazy. So it's my personal goal to try to destigmatize incredibly stigmatized disorder. Okay, thank you.